I speak as a Brazilian, as a progressive, and as a citizen of the world. The whole world is now united in a chain of analogous problems and solutions. The tendency now of the progressives in much of the world is to suppose that the orthodoxy, sometimes called neoliberalism, is universal, but the heresies are local. A universal orthodoxy, however, can be successfully combated only by universalizing heresies, as liberalism and socialism were in the 20th century. What we need now in the world are strong national projects. By a strong national project, I mean a project with at least three sets of attributes. First, it must mobilize the physical, economic, and human resources of the nation, and not depend on the whims and interests of foreign capital. Second, it must embark on a trajectory of bold institutional innovation, including innovation in the institutional forms of a market economy, of a democratic state, and of an independent civil society. The political, economic, and social institutions now established in the North Atlantic world should be seen as a subset of a much broader universe of possibilities. And third, these strong national projects should have as part of their mission to enable our countries to engage in the world economy without surrendering our ability to devise an independent path of national construction. An active globalism rather than a passive submission is what we desire. I speak in favor of one particular variant of these strong national projects, a variant that is defined by its commitment to the organization of socially inclusive economic growth and of a deeper democracy, a democracy that loosens the power of the past over the present, and that diminishes the dependence of change on crisis. What are the projects that would define the content of such an inclusive and democratic alternative? In the first place, the project of ensuring that the national state has an independent and strong source of financing for its strategy of national development. Many of our countries are rich in natural resources, but the wealth produced by these natural resources should not be used to finance the short-term operational expenses of the state. It should be used to invest in the future. The state should be able to rely on a very high tax take. It is not possible to develop alternatives without guaranteeing the financial independence of the state. We should live within our means. We should honor fiscal responsibility, but not for the purpose of genuflecting to the interests and prejudices of finance. Rather, for the purpose of ensuring that the government has a margin of maneuver, a margin to rebel, a margin to resist, a margin to innovate. The second project is the project of democratizing the market economy so that more people have more access to more markets in more ways. We cannot simply regulate the market economy. We cannot simply compensate for the inequalities generated in the market by resorting to programs of retrospective redistribution through tax and transfer, We need to reshape the institutional content of the market to ensure a sustained broadening of economic opportunity. Now, how are we to do that in our countries? In the first place, through a reinvention of industrial policy, in the context of the momentous change that is now taking place in the style of production throughout the world. Mass production is ceasing to be the dominant form of production, and a new form of production begins to emerge, a form that is characterized not simply by the accumulation of capital, technology, and knowledge, but also, and above all, by the transformation of production into a practice of permanent innovation. The contrast between supervision and execution is moderated. The distinctions among all specialized work roles are relativized. Cooperation and competition are mixed together in the same domains of activities. The best firms become more like the best schools. The fateful question is, who will participate in these new advanced sectors of production? Now, all over the world, the majority of the labor force remains excluded from these productive vanguards. We need a new style of industrial policy that is capable of disseminating these advanced practices throughout large sectors of the economy and of the society. This new industrial policy should have as its most important beneficiaries the small and medium-sized firms that are responsible for the preponderance of output and of jobs in all of our countries. It should have as its primary method the expansion of access to credit, to technology, to knowledge, and to advanced practice. And it should begin to develop a new institutional framework. On the vertical axis of relations between governments and firms, it should be a form of strategic coordination that is decentralized, pluralistic, participatory, and experimental. Not the American system of arm's-length regulation of business by government, and not the Northeast Asian system of imposition of a unitary trade and industrial policy by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. And on the horizontal axis of relations among firms, it should support new regimes of cooperative competition that enable these firms to pool resources and achieve economies of scale, even as they continue to compete against one another. Now, this inclusive form of the new economy has a direct counterpart in the reorganization of agriculture. And indeed, agriculture can be a vanguard in this transformation. In the first place, to supersede the false ideological contrast between entrepreneurial agriculture and family-scale agriculture. When family-scale agriculture acquires entrepreneurial attributes, agriculture, scientific agriculture, becomes a vanguard. In the second place, a commitment to the aggregation of value and to rural industrialization that can moderate the contrast between town and country and transform agriculture into an activity that is just as value-adding as industry or services. And in the third place, the creation in our countries of a national agricultural middle class as the vanguard of a mass of poorer workers who will advance behind this agricultural petty bourgeoisie. In this way, we begin to reshape the institutional content of the new economy and to give practical consequence to the ideological objective of socially inclusive economic growth. The third project is the project of enlisting finance in the service of production. In all the major market economies of the world today, the production system is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. What then is the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets? Theoretically, it's to finance production. In fact, finance is allowed to serve itself and to use the real economy as a pretext for its speculative activities. Finance can be a good servant, but it is a bad master. We need in our countries institutional innovations that make finance serve the productive agenda of society. For example, regulatory and tax changes that discourage financial activity with no plausible relation to the expansion of output or the enhancement of productivity. And innovations that channel long-term saving into long-term productive investment. For example, that mobilize some of the vast dormant potential of the capital that is stored in the public and private pension systems of the world to do the undone work of venture capital, to invest in the multitude of startup innovative enterprise. The fourth project is the project of educating our peoples. These economic alternatives cannot flourish, and democracy cannot be deepened unless we achieved a radical change in the character of education. We need a form of education that is analytic and problem-solving rather than informational, that uses information selectively as a device for acquiring the mastery of analytic capabilities, that sacrifices the combination of authoritarianism and individualism in the classroom to cooperation in teaching and in learning, and that approaches every subject dialectically from at least two contrasting points of view, rather than acquiescing in the anti-experimentalist dogmatism that now characterizes the dominant forms of education. This revolution in the character of education would allow us to place on a continuum general education and vocational training. We should not want in our countries a form of general education for the elites and then vocational training for the masses. Rather, we should want a spectrum in which general education and vocational training communicate with each other. General education emphasizes analysis and problematic thinking, and vocational training accords priority to generic practical and conceptual capabilities rather than to job-specific and machine-specific skills. In what institutional setting can such an educational revolution take place? In countries like ours that are large, unequal, and federal in structure, we must reconcile the local management of the schools with national standards of investment and quality. And to reconcile local management with national standards, we need not simply a national system of assessment of the schools and a mechanism to redistribute resources from richer places to poorer places, but also a mechanism for corrective intervention to take over local failing school systems, fix them, and return them fixed. A fifth project is to enhance the quality of public services, including the public services of health and education, through the engagement of civil society in the provision of public services. The greatest historical accomplishment of European social democracy, the accomplishment that we have most reason to admire, was heavy investment in people. But we need to innovate in the form of provision of public services. What do we have in the world today? We have what you might call administrative Fordism, the provision of low-quality, standardized public services by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. And the only alternative to that administrative Fordism appears to be the privatization of public services in favor of profit-driven firms. There is, however, an alternative that will become increasingly important in the course of the 21st century, and that is that the state help organize, finance, equip, and monitor independent civil society so that it participate in the experimental and competitive provision of public services as the best way of enhancing their quality. The state would ensure the universal minimum of public services, and the state might as well operate at the top, at the ceiling, in the development of the costliest and most advanced public services. But in the broad space between this floor and this ceiling, civil society could have a wide share in the provision of public services, and that might be the best way not only to enhance the quality of the services, but also to provoke the self-organization of civil society outside the state. A sixth project of national construction is to create a better basis for social solidarity or social cohesion in our countries. Money transfers organized by the state are not enough. Money is a weak social cement. The only adequate practical basis of social solidarity is direct responsibility to take care of other people outside the boundaries of one's own family. Every able-bodied adult ought to have at least two positions in society: a job in the production system, but also a social responsibility, a responsibility at some point in his life to take care of others. And it is in that way, only through this direct engagement, that we can guarantee social cohesion. A seventh project is the construction of the state. None of this that I am proposing can take place unless we have an effective state. And there are three distinct agendas of the construction of the state that we must execute in our countries simultaneously. First, there is the 19th century agenda that we have never completely implemented, of creating a professionalized and meritocratic bureaucracy. Second, there is the 20th century agenda of efficiency, of reinventing for the public sector forms of operation and of assessment that are associated with the private sector. It has to be a reinvention, not just a mechanical transposition. And third, there is the agenda of experimentalism that will become increasingly important in the course of the 21st century. Radicalizing the experimentalist potential of federalism to create countermodels of the future, but at the same time, engaging civil society in the experimental provision of public services to enhance their quality. The eighth project of national construction is the deepening of democracy. We shouldn't just imitate the forms of democratic life that are now established in the rich North Atlantic world. We want forms of democracy that diminish the power of the past on the present and the dependence of change on crisis. We want high-energy democracies. Now, a high-energy democracy should preserve the power of central decision, but at the same time, it should enable society to debate the national future and to create counter models of that future. Some of the innovations that we require to establish such a high-energy democracy would raise the temperature of politics, the organized level of popular engagement in political life. Other innovations would allow us rapidly to break impasse between the political branches of government. Yet others would allow particular localities or sectors to experiment with alternatives to the national path. In all of these ways, we would create a form of democratic life that does not need the experience of war or of economic collapse to permit structural change. There is an outline of a strong national project in the conditions of many of the contemporary societies that serves the twin goals of democratizing the market and deepening democracy. Is there a practical social basis in our countries for such an alternative? I assert that there is, that we can create a productivist alliance, an alliance of industrialists, of farmers, and of workers, as a counterweight to the interests of rentiers, and that this productivist alliance is the indispensable social basis for a progressive alternative. What then is the main obstacle? The main obstacle in many of our countries is our mental colonialism. It's the lack of ideas. Ideas alone cannot change the world, but without ideas, we cannot change the world. What we need now is the imagination of alternatives. Imagination to the rescue.